Right, today I am with Dr. Jared Ross. And Jared, you're a physician specializing in emergency medicine and addiction medicine. And you reached out to me a little while back about some shared experiences with waking up from the left, so to speak. If you, both of us are similarly positioned politically in some ways in our views, as we've come from being more left oriented to being somewhat more centrist. And I'm really interested in hearing you elaborate on that and what your process has been. And also, I'd like to hear more about how woke ideology is impacting medicine in your view. And you mentioned also some ways that wokeism is impacting the Jewish community and conversations therein. So thank you so much for joining me, and I really look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Leslie, it's really a pleasure and an honor to be on your show. Thank you so much for inviting me to do this. I've really admired your work from some of your early work, which was just you holding a phone and talking about your experience at Antioch. And so and thank you again for having me today.
Well, thank you.
It's really a shame that this country has strayed so far from the ideals of Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And the idea is that this is a meritocracy with individual rights, individual freedoms, but also individual responsibility and true independence. And I think we've also lost that American work ethic that we're famous for, and we don't quite value the free market capitalism that has made America the land where people come to achieve the American dream. And instead, we've really gone to embrace dependence, narcissism, victimhood, identity politics, which includes critical race theory and so-called anti-racism. And then I think this very harmful idea that truth is subjective, this idea of my truth and your truth, and that every feeling and every opinion is as valid as any other, and that we have become detached from reality.
Yeah, and you, it sounds like you have come to have these perspectives and views over time. And what was your process in coming into this conversation in this way? What started to shift for you and make you, I guess, where did you come from and how did you get there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a very important story to tell, and one that I don't get to tell as much as I'd like to. I was born and raised outside of Los Angeles in Santa Monica, California, to New York Jewish parents who were both very far to the left and are no longer, but were at the time. And I think that was and is very common within the Jewish community, that everyone's on the left. The left is the right place to be, or the correct place to be, the moral high ground. And no one really thinks this, even gives second thought to it. And I can't say I was very involved in politics in general, but it didn't even cross my mind that there was anything other out there. And then I moved to Pittsburgh to attend Carnegie Mellon University for college, and I remember becoming friends with someone who was the president, I believe, of the the young Republicans on campus. And I became friends with her through a wilderness activity, something unrelated, and then realized, and I would just, ridicule her for being a part of that group. And then towards the end of my time in college in the spring of 2008, I had the opportunity to help organize the kickoff of Chelsea Clinton's college bus tour across the state of Pennsylvania. And this was a sub-campaign within Hillary Clinton's campaign for the presidency in 2008. And so I put my college work on hold and worked really full time to coordinate this amazing honor that we were going to have Chelsea Clinton kick off this statewide bus tour across, Pennsylvania, a state that has a lot of higher education across the entire state, and organized this event, countless hours over 2 weeks doing this, and had prepared a speech to introduce Chelsea at the event. And just before the event went on, I was told by one of the campaign organizers that I would not be introducing Chelsea, and that instead a Black woman would be introducing Chelsea.
Oh.
That was important for optics, because Hillary Clinton's biggest competition was coming from Barack Obama.
Specifically because she was a Black woman, she was being chosen instead of you.
Absolutely. And she was someone who had minimal, if any, involvement over the last 2 weeks. And, I put my coursework aside and was just dedicated, meeting with campus leadership, campus police, meeting with the city police. I mean, there was a lot of logistics that went into planning this event, which actually coincided with our spring carnival for the school. And this was held on the carnival stage. So a lot that went into this.
So talk about tokenizing. This is, yeah.
Absolutely. But believe it or not, I was hurt. I was hurt and disappointed.
Yeah.
This really wasn't a turning point for me yet.
Okay. It was just one thing that happened.
Yeah.
Maybe in hindsight, it looked more clear than it did at the time. Yeah.
It was a start to a process. And I think around this time, I was also exposed to the idea of Reconstructionist Judaism.
Okay. I'm not familiar with that concept.
Judaism classically has, and we try to say streams rather than sects, but again, I think that's policing language, unfortunately. Traditionally in the US, we have the Reform movement, the conservative movement, and then the modern Orthodox movement. And then we have the Hasidic streams, or Haredi streams. And they believe that the Torah, or what non-Jews would refer to as the Old Testament, is the writing of God. And that it's not to be interpreted. And then these modern American streams that have occurred over the last couple hundred years are non-Haredi and believe that the Torah is a work of historical and religious importance.
Okay.
But because it's not written by God, it can be interpreted by humans. And there have been numerous smaller branches off of Judaism over the years, including humanism and Kabbalah, which is a Jewish mysticism. I was really raised in a in a non-affiliated synagogue, and then was exposed to Reconstructionist Judaism towards the end of my college career, and realized how much similarity there was between my background and what was being called Reconstructionist. And Reconstructionist Judaism is very much based on community and equality, egalitarianism, and individual interpretation and respect for others' interpretations, and really forming community, about grassroots community. Unfortunately, today, Reconstructionist Judaism is not that. Reconstructionist Judaism really jumped on the social justice bandwagon and has become very, very politically involved in far left, far progressive ideology, unfortunately.
Was Reconstructionist Judaism a new stream or something that was newly emerging, or is this an older stream that was just taking hold and coming into your life at this time?
So, great question. It's a newer stream in terms
Okay.
of Jewish streams. It came out in the 1970s
Okay.
by an Orthodox rabbi, Mordechai Kaplan,
Okay.
whose daughter very much wanted to be a rabbi. And the Orthodox faith does not allow women on the bima.
Okay. Okay.
Or up on the to lead prayer.
Okay.
And so together they created this new stream, originally in New York, that took off in New York, and then LA, and then Chicago, where we have large Jewish communities, and then has spread around the country and around the world, but still definitely one of the newer and smaller streams of Judaism.
And so I guess it sounds like it was a bit more progressive in some ways, politically and socially, with the women being able to hold certain positions and such.
Definitely more progressive than Orthodox Judaism.
Okay.
But I think more traditional than Reform Judaism, which is the most common affiliation of Jews in the US who are affiliated.
Okay.
So you have to remember that most Jews here in the US are not affiliated with any stream.
Okay.
And then the Reform movement represents the largest movement here in the US. And maybe even more even differentiated from the conservative movement, which was a branch off of the Reform movement, to say, well, we've got the conservatives out, or we've got the Orthodox out here, and we've got the Reform out here, and we need to find some middle ground and conserve some of those religious ideas. And so you find that's a stream, and it's okay, but it's not. There's still, unfortunately, a lot of dogma there. There's even within Judaism, which really ingrains the idea of questioning authority and questioning yourself and constant reflection. Conservative Judaism as a whole is a little bit rigid, or at least I found it a little bit rigid, and also not as joyous as the upbringing I came to. I found that the Reform movement was very watered down, and that the conservative movement, unfortunately, while being more religious was just not joyous, was just not something I really wanted to attend. There's not as much singing. It's just a little bit too somber.
Okay.
And I think, at least for me, faith is a really important way to realize life and enjoy life.
And so Reconstructionist Judaism was sort of becoming a part of your world when you were in college, then around the same time you were really politically active.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it really allowed me to see individualism as well, and to appreciate that. And as I said, unfortunately, the Reconstructionist movement is not what it was in 2008, as I was finding it, and has strayed far from that. But the next step in my journey was that I moved to DC after college, was pursuing an internship and then grad school. And I had briefly in college done some volunteering with the Red Cross. And while in grad school in DC on the way home, I ran across a condo building just down the block from my apartment building that was had suffered a massive fire, and all the power was completely turned off to the whole building, and everyone 20, 30 units were displaced. And I said, oh, I know what we need to do. We need to call the Red Cross. And the Red Cross showed up, and I said, okay, well, I'll help fill out paperwork and get stuff going. And they said to me, we need you, you know what you're doing. Like, how do we not know you're here in DC? And I said, I'm, here to do well in grad school and get into medical school. I don't know that I have time to be volunteering again. But they pushed pretty hard, and I ended up actually at one point filling a full-time position that they had vacant as a volunteer. And so what I did in DC was respond out to these disasters. And I know people think the Red Cross is going to, hurricanes and floods, but 90+% of it is house fires and apartment fires, people who are displaced.
Smaller scale.
Yeah, a lot of smaller scale events. And in DC, running a few of these a week. And I was going out a lot to Southeast DC, to the Anacostia, which is very impoverished, socioeconomically depressed area of DC, one of the most in our country. A lot of violence, HIV positive rates of 20%, rival that of parts of Africa. Huge amounts of poverty. Those who are employed are primarily employed with either the DC government or the federal government. And so what I saw there was showing up to help people in their time of greatest need. And I had been a firefighter and an EMT and a paramedic, and knew that I was on this trajectory towards medical school. But I showed up and I saw a shocking level of entitlement culture. And as we, would give people vouchers for hotel rooms, give them prepaid debit cards to get some clothing to get them through the next 72 hours, give them debit cards for food, replace their medication that had been lost in the fire, and then also connect them with mental health services. Constantly heard, complaints that this isn't enough money. And, we had these lines that, this is not insurance, this is emergency assistance to get you through the next 72 hours. And the attitudes we face, the threats of violence, actual violence, people attempting to manipulate the system and bring neighbors into their house and say, well, we all live here, so we need more money.
Oh, wow.
This isn't enough to replace my wardrobe. And I said, no, it's not intended as insurance, and then it's, well,
It's
I
a
pay my
gift.
tax.
It's like
Right.
yeah.
It's a gift.
Yeah.
Um, and then, people who say, well, I pay my taxes, I'm, entitled to this. And I said, well, when we did your intake, you said that your income was SSI, so you're not
Okay.
paying
Yeah.
taxes.
No.
But that aside, that the Red Cross is a non-governmental nonprofit that's funded by donations. It's the only nonprofit that has a congressional mandate, which is interesting. But we're not, this is not government funds. Uh, and just the level of, we would have people, we would give them a 2-day hotel voucher. They would refuse to leave the room after 2 nights was up.
Oh,
And
wow. Yeah.
we couldn't keep contracts with hotels in DC. We had clients who urinated and defecated in their room.
Oh my
We had
gosh.
clients who brought dogs into the room that tore up the room.
Wow.
We had clients that tore up hotels. And this again added fuel to this fire, that was, maybe this wasn't working.
It was changing your perspective
Yeah,
on some of your political foundations.
absolutely. And then I think it was a friend of mine in DC, Eric, who's now actually a member of the Democratic Party, very active in it, who trained as a statistician but worked in economics, and first introduced me to some of these, I think, libertarian ideas, especially around marriage equality, and this idea of kind of keeping government out of our lives. And I think it was his idea. I really need to give him credit for this. And this was as all these equality talks were going on across the nation. That maybe the government shouldn't be involved in marriage. Maybe the government should issue civil unions to any 2 consenting adults, and that religious institutions should deal with marriage, which is historically a religious idea, and that civil union is what applies to legal benefits and tax filings, and marriage is related to faith, and that you as 2 consenting adults can go get married, get a civil union, or both, or neither, whatever you want. And that this removes a lot of this, again, this ideal of separation of church and state, removing this language from government. And this really struck a chord with me. And again, I continued to explore those ideals.
And about what year was this? And where were you in your progression through, I guess, coming to where you are right now?
Yeah, I was still in that progression. I was in DC from the summer of 2008. And actually, even once I moved to DC, I actually worked on Hillary's campaign in DC.
Okay.
So despite that disappointment in Pittsburgh, I worked on her campaign in DC before she dropped out of the race. And then I stayed in DC for just about 2 years, until the summer of 2010, when I started medical school. And I think I was, less involved in politics throughout medical school. I was moving around quite a bit, and focused on studying, getting into internship and then residency. And then I think things around 2017, I was in Detroit in residency for emergency medicine. And one of my co-residents was very big into tactical medicine and was trying to resurrect a program where we were involved with the SWAT team
Okay.
and
Okay.
serving as physicians with the SWAT team.
Hmm.
And this really seemed of interest to me. Again, I had grown up in Southern California in a very, liberal, politically liberal background, and had no experience with firearms.
Mm.
And what I did was I did a self-assessment, and I said, what's going to prevent me from being on this SWAT team? And I said, it's not my medical knowledge, uh, but I think it's my knowledge of tactics and of firearms. And I don't have to be a sharpshooter, but I have to understand this and be comfortable with this.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started realizing that I need to educate myself on firearms and tactics as well. And went to Connecticut to take a tactical medicine course, but also went out to the Las Vegas area to take a 4-day pistol course and learn how to use pistols. I realized at some point that I really needed to purchase my own firearm. There's only so much you can do going to a range and renting something, that some of this is just repetition, and that you need to sit at home and work with this dry practice without ammunition. And I, did this really right. I invested heavily in safes. I had a safe in my bedroom and a safe in my car and a lockbox to transport it. And my girlfriend at the time, very, very Jewish, very, very liberal as well, was, kind of turned to me and said, what happened to you? I thought I was dating this nice Jewish boy. And again, the pieces started clicking that for some reason that because I now was looking to own a firearm, I was no longer meeting these ideals of the left, and unfortunately of the American Jewish community as well. And I was, mentioned this to a colleague, a co-resident of mine, Bonnie, and she mentioned to me, her husband, Larry, was actually a retired police officer and was working as a range instructor at one of the local ranges in Detroit. So I was really trying to figure out, what firearm did I need? And she introduced me to him. And I spent some time at the range, spent a whole day at the range with him, and, had the opportunity to try out multiple firearms. And we talked politics while we were there. And he introduced me to this idea of small L libertarianism, this libertarian values, but not really the libertarian party.
So this was kind of the second time you'd really been introduced to this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, got, very much got into gun ownership and understanding self-defense and understanding our Second Amendment, which I really hadn't.
Wow, so you really had quite a number of perspective shifts going on over the course of this decade, really.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then in 2020, while I was living in St. Louis, I actually, again, really not quite sure where I was, but I wrote myself in on the ticket for the Libertarian Party.
Oh, wow.
And
ran for office.
I ran for office, spur of the moment decision. I've heard from the party that I received 2 votes. I highly, highly, highly doubt that. I really think it was just my one, but well, who knows? Maybe I briefly mentioned this to a friend who thought it was a funny idea to write me in. But I was elected and served on the board of directors. Actually, served as the treasurer for the party in St. Louis for just over a year until I moved down here to Charleston, South Carolina.
And so during all this time, as you're having these shifts, the culture is also shifting, and
Absolutely.
we've seen as what I know. I guess my simple way of saying it is that the left has moved really far left to where it's not doesn't represent liberal values anymore. Where you're seeing leftist authoritarianism in our left-wing politics. And so you're shifting, you're having these realizations, and at the same time the culture is shifting underneath of you. And how are you seeing this show up both in your personal life, personal political perspective, your work as a doctor, and in the Jewish community?
Absolutely. I think part of this shift was definitely even earlier on. I think my mom reacted very strongly to the horrific terrorism of 9/11, and she began a shift from the very far left to the very far right, and my father followed slowly. And I was very cautious of this, and but again, this was kind of another piece of the puzzle. But absolutely, I was seeing, as you were, this drastic shift from liberalism and individual rights as laid down by the founders of this country towards this leftist authoritarianism. And that was very hard for me to reckon with. And I think I started to really reject liberal politics, but I wasn't, and still am not on board with the right. I think some of that comes from my skepticism of big politics, of political machines, of that there's corruption, that power breeds corruption, and that it doesn't so much matter which side you're on, that can really be a problem. And as I was, interacting more with the Libertarian Party, I did join up as a member of the board. I was kind of forced into joining. Interestingly, the Libertarian Party doesn't require you to join the national party. You can instead just opt to join your state party, but that seemed more difficult, so I paid my dues to the national party. But that was really a wonderful place to have discussions, and we called it. I actually called it a safe space, and somewhat ironically, but it was really the idea was that we would come together once a month, and over some drinks, we would discuss political issues, and that everything was on the table. It was an open discussion, but this was about the issues. It was not, we were not, no personal attacks. And I hosted a lot of our meetings, most of our meetings, and I set down these ground rules, and people would say to me, who do you think we are? Like, why would we be attacking each other over these? We're here to attack the issues. And and I just said, look around at the world. Like, this is, I hate that I have to say this, but this is to a large degree the world we're living in, where people are being attacked for their beliefs.
Right.
And it's not a dialogue. It's not attacking the issues. It's really attacking individuals, unfortunately. And we've seen, several people with their careers who have been destroyed. I think, one big shout out for me is to Dr. Stanley Goldfarb, who is the founder of Do No Harm Medicine, which has worked very hard in medicine to remove these progressive discriminatory ideologies. And Dr. Goldfarb was a dean of medicine at the University of Pennsylvania, and a practicing nephrologist, I believe, kidney doctor, widely published, widely respected. And he came out against discriminatory practices, so-called anti-racism, or and against critical race theory. And he was removed from his position, and was fired from the university, and his whole academic career was completely derailed.
And what will you say a little more about what he was objecting to? What is the application of anti-racism to medicine look like?
So I think the biggest application here is in combating health disparities, right? No one will deny that we have severe health disparities in this country.
By race.
By race, by socioeconomic status. But if we just look at race, and we just look at Black Americans, to keep things, very simple and straightforward, there are absolutely disparities there, in terms of life expectancy, in terms of morbidity, in terms of care. And I think the suggestion of the far left is that this is due to racism, systemic racism, unconscious bias, and that along with that, the solution to this is that we need more Black doctors. And fully leaning into this incredibly racist idea that only Black doctors can provide proper care for Black patients, which is just incredibly appalling. And again, goes to a lot of our affirmative action policies across academia and culture and society that started in the 70s. And I think, we have to look at what was the intent of these policies when they were introduced. The idea of this was that we're, getting out of Jim Crow, and we need to allow one generation to catch up. So we're going to temporarily institute these affirmative action policies, which are really discrimination, right? Discrimination to solve past discrimination. To allow Blacks to advance in society. And instead, we're, 50 years later, we're actually leaning into this more and more. And so what you've seen is a lowering of standards, right? We're not living in this meritocracy. We've shifted completely from our country's founding on equality or equal opportunity to equity, which means equal outcomes. And I think people often conflate the two terms. don't understand the massive difference. They are diametrically opposed and completely incompatible with each other. That if you are allowing for equality, if you're giving everyone an equal chance, you are not going to have equity. And if you have equity, you are thereby discriminating and not giving everyone equality. And this hurts everyone. I mean, I think a lot of these, a lot of the press and the Supreme Court findings have really shown how the Asian populations have been hurt by these policies.
Yeah.
But this hurts the people it's really meant to help. In the Black community, is what we've done is we've lowered standards, and we see this in medical school, we see this in law school, we see this in college, we see higher dropout rates, we see failure to pass medical boards or to pass the bar. And then the left just leans into that more and says, no, the tests are racist. It's not that or that testing is racist, or that.
Yeah, it's a refusal to investigate other variables and just focusing on racism. And as you say, like in medicine, the assertion is that if there are disparate health outcomes, it must be because of some kind of prejudice in the doctors towards the patients. So replace the white doctors with more Black doctors, and that will be a catch-all. It seems like a very simplistic, reductive response.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think we've got, tons of evidence that that's just not the case. I spent 2 years working at an inner city, very, very impoverished hospital in St. Louis. The hospital, the first year I was there, the hospital lost $75 million. The second year I was there, we lost $90 million.
Wow.
And it was a nonprofit hospital that still, I can tell you that nonprofit would have loved to close that hospital, and did take services away right and left. We went from a level 1 trauma center to a level 2 to a level 3 to a level 4, and then completely resigned our trauma status, all voluntarily. We lost our pediatric services. We lost our OBGYN services. I mean, anything
because it just wasn't sustainable.
It wasn't sustainable. And I think they couldn't close the hospital because it was the only hospital in the northeast part of St. Louis County, which is very impoverished and predominantly Black. And I think
so it was a really needed service, but there just wasn't funding for it.
Absolutely. And there wasn't the reimbursement for it. But you looked at, on a day-to-day basis, I would be called racist. I mean, it was just, and everyone, everyone there was it was unfortunate, because anytime a patient who was Black, which were 90% of our patients, felt like we had taken someone else out of the ER waiting room before them, it was or something they didn't like, weren't willing to give them narcotics, whatever it was racism.
So you're seeing as racism becomes this sort of catch-all.
Oh,
it's the boogeyman. It's the thing that it's the source of all the problem.
Absolutely. And we had a number of, we had a completely mixed workforce there. And a lot of people came to work there. I mean, I saw nurses that would last 1 week or even one shift, because it was a very, very challenging place to work, because of the patients were very socioeconomically depressed and didn't have good access to care. The hospital was under-resourced. We saw a lot of very sick patients, a lot of violence, and even had violence and violent threats, on us as staff. And so, but for those of us who did succeed there, we thrived in this. We thrived against that adversity, really trying to to put ourselves, insert ourselves into the worst of the worst situations to try to make positive change. And I really felt like I was doing that. I really went to work every day, saying, how can we save lives today? Give me something to fight for here.
Well, if not through anti-racist policies, which are just more discrimination, and like you said, in order to make up for past discrimination, if not for those, what is a better way to alleviate some of these disparities? Do you have thoughts about that in medicine?
Absolutely. So I think first of all, just to, fully dispel this, I think, all we need to do is look at African immigrants, specifically Nigerian immigrants, right? They come to this country on from a different culture, a different society, speaking a different language, speaking English with a thick accent, on average with darker skin than Black descendants of slavery. And despite all that adversity coming from a third world country, they are wildly successful. And many of the doctors I've worked with are Nigerian immigrants and African immigrants. And so if this was truly based on race and truly based on skin color, I don't think you'd be seeing these people succeed and flourish. And instead, when we lower standards, we hurt everyone. We hurt those, very top of their class Black students who have to deal with this everlasting doubt. Was I admitted to medical school because of my achievements, or was I admitted because of the color of my skin? And am I deserving of this? We talk in medicine quite a bit about imposter syndrome. And I think, unfortunately, as these progressive ideologies have infiltrated our life, that we get into this unhealthy amount of self-doubt and self-questioning that this perpetuates.
Yeah.
But I think we really need to look at other things, look at expectations. Family structure is huge, right? I mean, when we created these welfare programs, we incentivized single motherhood. And that's just, by and large, that's just not going to be a healthy environment. Kids are going to get more time and attention and more financial stability if they have two parents. And what do we see in the Black community that I think, comparing and contrasting Blacks descendant of slaves versus African immigrants, we see these intact family structures. We see a huge emphasis on the importance of education.
So you would point to the American political system as the source of the problem. Or I guess maybe I'm making too simple a statement, but you think that the problems are generationally political, the way that we've created a socioeconomic class that's dependent on this welfare state, and that has had its family structure destroyed through political decision making.
Absolutely. And I don't necessarily put all of the blame on politics, but we as humans respond to incentives. We do a very good job responding to incentives. That's the basis of economics. And I have no formal training in economics, but libertarianism comes out of Austrian economic theory. And so I've learned a lot about economics and economic incentives. And so, there are certainly cultural factors, and there's certainly things that we could have done or still can do to promote self-improvement. But instead, under the guise of help, we have really instituted programs that are absolutely detrimental to those who have, who were, born to people who suffered through Jim Crow and suffered actual racial discrimination. I think that's one of the things that comes up when you talk about this is you get, called out for denying racism, and absolutely not. I mean, our country has an absolute history of racism, as do most of the countries around the world.
Well, it's in-group, out-group dynamics, which
absolutely
is part of human nature. So yeah,
absolutely. There's so much evolutionary biology behind that, and evolutionary psychology, and you can't even talk about that. I mean, if you start talking about, we have this this cliche that, for white people, all Black people look the same, right? And that's racism, that's systemic racism. What that is that's outlier homogeneity. That's 6 million years of evolution as a species, when we lived in small hunter-gatherer communities, that it wasn't important for us to distinguish between members of rival factions, that we just needed to know, if you're one of my people, I need to know who you are because we have some trade relationship, we have some social relationship, whatever that may be. But that if you look different than me, you're an enemy, and I need to, that my first response needs to be fear. So this is an evolutionary process. We don't live in hunter-gatherer societies. America is the great melting pot. And this idea of race is so unimportant. I mean, that's I think what Martin Luther King Jr. was getting at it is why is this why is this so important? And again, even to suggest colorblindness today is offensive and considered racism. But we say it's denying culture, and it's not. Culture's not your skin color. Culture's, who you affiliate with, what your values are, what your faith is, what activities you practice. It really doesn't have to distill down to the color of your skin, and it shouldn't. That should be the least important thing about you. But instead, we've gotten into this place where the color of your skin is the most important thing about you.
Well, and the kind of welfare policies that you're describing, this has been coming up a lot in conversations lately. The idea of weaponized compassion and this, are we overly compassionate? Have we become too feminine a culture in the way that we dole out empathy and compassion? And I think, well, on what scale are you looking? Because there's an infantilizing kind of compassion, which is just put the pacifier back in the baby's mouth, just quickly placate the person who's distressed. And then there's something that's more long-term. Like if you're really compassionate and you really care about someone's long-term success, you don't do the thing for them that just soothes their immediate need. You help them to, as you say, you incentivize them to learn for themselves, to improve their life and to strive for something more. And you see them as a peer, and you see them as someone who's capable of achieving. And so I think that there's this really short-term kind of compassion that's being overemphasized. This like just put out the fire, stop the bleeding, stop the crying, and it is very infantilizing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we have this, move towards, and you can speak to this better than I can, but this idea of, trauma-informed care and focusing so much on, digging up past
Mhm.
harms.
Mhm.
And, there's a place for that. There's a
Mhm.
place to grieve.
Mhm.
But we have moved so far away from a solutions oriented society
Yeah.
towards, how do you as a therapist, and I do some addiction medicine work as well, and working towards my board certification in addiction, and addiction's a whole nother realm of medicine, unfortunately, very, very politically co-opted,
Mm.
far more than emergency medicine, for instance.
Mm.
And how do we, say, I love to quote the Serenity Prayer,
Mhm.
even as a Jew, to accept the things we can't change, but to change the things we can, and to know the difference.
Mhm.
And I
Mhm.
think we spend so much time not knowing the difference, and just whining and crying, and again, I don't mean to dismiss the importance of taking time for grief, and to go through the grieving
Right.
process. But then at some point you need to say, okay, how do I move on? How do I,
Mhm.
fight this adversity? How do I push forward and
Yeah.
improve my life? And
Yeah,
you're
there's
absolutely right. We become a culture where we just continue to mope,
Mhm. Mhm.
and
Well, there's
and then
the idea
also,
that it's what happened to you isn't your fault, but how you respond to it is your responsibility.
right. And instead we're taught that, someone else is responsible
Mhm.
for fixing our life, that we're here
Mhm.
to wait for, you know, and whether it be these welfare programs,
Mhm.
this idea that, you know, student loans are not our responsibility, that we didn't sign up for that, that we're being
Mhm.
oppressed. Um, I
Yeah.
had another
Yeah.
example there.
Well,
Um,
I know that you wanted to share a couple of points. One about I know you wanted to make a further point about woke, like so-called wokeism in the Jewish community, and then you had a point about self-assessments that I was interested in hearing a little bit about.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, um, I think I'll start with the self-assessment,
Sure.
if that's okay.
Yeah.
So, um, when I decided I really wanted to be on the Detroit Police SWAT team, and I made this self-assessment, and I say, what's going to keep me out of this? It's not
Mhm.
my medical skill, but it's my firearm skill.
Mhm.
And then saying, I need to then overcome this weakness. And what do I need to do? I need to get training, and I need to better myself for this job. I mean, it wasn't going to
Mhm.
pay, but it was,
Mm.
whatever you want to pursue. And, I actually was interviewing for a job at this inner city hospital. Um, and my future boss asked me, tell me a story about overcoming a weakness.
Mm.
And I told him this story of joining the SWAT team in residency, which, probably wasn't the most insightful decision at the time, interviewing to be at an inner city hospital. Um, but over the years I worked there, he quoted me numerous times, and told me when we worked together how much he admired that level of insight and self-awareness,
Mm.
and not just making that assessment, but then making that assessment and making change.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so we recently had the uh, Rosh Hashanah, or the Jewish New Year,
Mhm.
And I think, New Year's resolutions are kind of more an American idea than a Jewish idea. But I celebrate both New Year's, so I make two New Year's resolutions, or at the very least, it gets me a little opportunity to get a jump start onto the January New Year's resolution. But recently, I've been into kite surfing for a few years here, and I just haven't. I'm not very good at it. I'd love to be better. Love to really enjoy it, and part of that is getting out and spending more time with it. But I really said, what do I not, what am I not doing well here? And for me, that was that I've never been a board sport person before. I never, I was a skier, not a snowboarder. I never wakeboarded. I never skateboarded. And so I said, how can I get better at this, 2 feet on a board moving sideways thing? And so I went and started taking, wakeboarding lessons at a local park. And someone said to me, oh, you're getting into wakeboarding? Don't you have enough hobbies? And I said, no, I have no interest in wakeboarding. I'm only doing this because I want to learn a specific skill to apply to improving something else I'm doing. And so I think there's a lot of importance to having that insight, and then being able to say, this is a weakness of mine. I want to change this. How do I change this? How do I then go out and change this? And then how do I test that feedback loop? Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of this comes into play, and this is some of the consulting work I do in process improvement. This is some of the culture of safety work I do in the aviation space, is to say, how do we continue to, how do we do process improvement? How do we evaluate our shortcomings and improve them? And I think that's what therapy should be about and used to be about, and unfortunately has kind of instead become this pillow to cry on, unfortunately. I don't know, does that seem to ring true to your experience?
Well, I can see, I can see the point that you're making. And I think that your point about self-assessments is valuable, because you're saying, take an honest look at your own strengths and weaknesses. And if you have the opportunity, if you have a goal and you have the ability to seriously look at your shortcomings and what might prevent you from reaching that goal, and be honest with yourself, then you have the opportunity to actually improve your chances of reaching your goal. And so just that ability to be honest with oneself, and it sort of parallels the identity politics idea of checking your biases. And there's this idea of searching yourself for, what are you hiding from yourself? And I, unlike with the check your biases, which if you check and you feel like maybe you don't have the biases that they're accusing you of, you still have them, you just didn't see them. You're just advocating for an honest look at yourself, strengths and weaknesses, and then taking responsibility for your weaknesses in a given area and doing what you can to improve them.
Absolutely. And this being self-assessment and self-improvement, not self-flagellation, not getting in front of a room and saying, I don't, I suck at kite surfing because I can't wakeboard. And that's this huge problem with this anti-racism CRT issue. It's, you thought we would have learned in the 1700s from the Salem witch trials, right? I mean, it's that thing again, if you say you're not a witch, you're a witch.
You're a witch, yeah, absolutely.
And if you are a witch, you need to be killed. And it's this it's this no-win situation.
Yeah, it's mind reading.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for making that point. I think it's well made. And then finally, did you want to express something about how you've seen the wokeness? Does this tie into what you were talking about earlier with Reconstructionist Judaism?
I think it does.
Okay.
I think, I did want to touch on something in medicine I think we talked about a race, and I'll kind of tie this in if that's okay.
Mhm.
Um, I think this gender ideology has just been incredibly harmful to medicine, and is again a part of medicine where if you don't, if you don't go along with this, you can lose your job, you can lose your medical license in some states. And as you know, in the therapy world, this is probably even worse than in medicine. That if, but you know, and adults being adults, again, I am very strong in libertarian values. I support your right as a competent adult to make your own life decisions, whether or not I agree with them.
Mhm.
That's not my, if you're not harming anyone but yourself as an adult, I don't see the role of government or anyone else in interfering with that.
Mhm.
But this gender ideology in children has just been devastating, and this is, we see this in the rates that this pops up. Dr. Debra So's book is amazing, and Abigail Shrier's book, where these are kids that have underlying depression, underlying anxiety. A lot of them are on the autism spectrum, and a whole nother question about why are we seeing these increased rates of
Mhm.
mental illness in our younger generation. Is this because of social media? Is this because of cultural and political philosophy? But these children really need help. They need therapy. I mean, I think everyone needs therapy. Thank you so much for what you do. Whether it be coaching or therapy, how clinical, different terms we use for it.
Mhm.
But everyone needs someone to help guide them through life towards achieving their best life, who doesn't have a stake in that. And so
Mhm.
whether that's a religious leader or a life coach or a coach or a counselor or a therapist, whoever that is, I think
Mhm.
that's so important. But instead, we, railroad these kids onto, puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones and mutilating surgeries under this myth that, if we don't affirm this, they'll kill themselves. And
Mhm.
the data just doesn't bear this out. The data bears out that post surgery is the highest time of regret, the highest time of suicide. Um, and
Right.
and
And
we
taking that short-term compassion perspective, cutting off your
absolutely,
genitals is an awful pacifier.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And we don't affirm other delusions in
Mhm.
medicine or in walks of life.
Yeah.
We don't affirm anorexia.
Mhm.
We instead we provide compassionate treatment and reinforce reality.
Right.
Schizophrenia is the same way. I'm
Right.
not gonna. I don't reinforce that. I don't
Mhm.
affirm that.
Yeah.
Uh, and it's become such a problem. And I think that's a lot of what we've seen um, in in American Judaism as well.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, is and again very distinct from Israeli Judaism.
Mhm.
We have about the same number, 6 million Jews here in the U.S., about 7 million in Israel. But Israel's a very different ideal and a very different culture. They have a lot of, they have a mandatory military service or public service
Mhm.
for 3 years, either after high school or after college. Um, but yeah, and Jews as a marginalized group and as a targeted group. I mean, targeted especially for violence and violence from extremists. It's
Mhm.
not this. I mean, this idea is perpetuated in the Jewish community that the conservative Christian right is the modern day KKK, and they want to kill the blacks and kill the Jews. And it couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, I don't believe that we're the chosen people. I don't believe that there's a chosen people. But a lot of these conservative Christians believe that Jews are the chosen people, and and these are not. I mean, that this is not the enemy. These are some of the, and as this terrorist attack, which is truly on, magnitudes beyond what we saw on 9/11, and not at all to diminish 9/11, but this has been, a terrorist attack on remarkable scale and appalling scale. That we still haven't and that we haven't come to terms with, unfortunately. And I think some of this is unfortunately media bias that's not getting through. But we have issues of anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, it's not coming from the right, and that there's a lot of hesitancy in Judaism to embrace our Second Amendment rights and to say, again, ultimate responsibility is on you, and you're responsible for you and your family.
So you again see that as a political manipulation.
Absolutely. But when you talk about, well, we've had huge rates of anti-Semitism, let's work on education on self-defense and firearms, and it's like, oh no, firearms are dangerous. And it's just so hard to fight back on. And then again, if you say, if you quote Genesis and say, God created man and woman, that's unacceptable. That's offensive. That's denying. That's what trans genocide. We've even seen Jews promoting reproductive freedom as a Jewish value, and again, I take a very moderate stance on abortion. I don't think it should be illegal. I think it's immoral, and I think I understand that people make different decisions, and instead we can't focus on discussions about birth control because we're so focused on abortion. How do we minimize harm? Again, as an addiction doc, harm reduction, right? But instead we get so caught up in this, and we can't step back, and then we're twisting Torah. We're it's one thing to say I disagree with Judaism's with the Torah's beliefs on homosexuality, right? I think, but I can't twist that. I mean, I just say I disagree with it. You can say I disagree with the biblical teachings or the Torah teachings on abortion, but instead there's been this move to co-opt Judaism and say, I'm gonna pigeonhole this to fit my needs.
So instead of just an honest disagreement, it's a massaging of the source material to make it kind of represent what you want it to represent.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think there's nothing wrong with honest disagreement. I think, in fact, what we need more honest disagreement. We need more difficult conversations, and people are afraid to have these difficult conversations. They're unfortunately having them on social media where people are hiding behind a screen. They're a keyboard warrior, and it quickly deteriorates, unfortunately, into personal attacks, where we can't sit down and say, I don't think anyone disagrees that and both sides politicize this, right? With abortion, the left says, the right is making it so that mothers whose lives are at risk are gonna die, and that's just not true. That's just a complete falsification. Anytime a mother's life is at risk, it's this idea that ectopic pregnancies need to be
Yeah.
But then on the other hand, to say that abortion is completely acceptable, it's a completely amoral decision, it's just a clump of cells, is so misleading as well. And to say, there, life begins at conception, there's some viability, there's a certain responsibility of the mother to care for that child until they're delivered. And then afterwards, that child is not independent, but that child can be cared for by anyone, right? And to just acknowledge some of these, acknowledge our religious teachings, if you're religious, and to say, let's have an open and honest discussion about this. What do we do with fetal anomalies? Unfortunately, Jews are predisposed to Tay-Sachs, which is an awful disease with children living, 2 to 3 years and dying this slow, painful death. Is it maybe more compassionate to have genetic testing and then abort a fetus that has Tay-Sachs? And again, that's an individual and a moral decision, and I just don't see that should be a decision left in the hands of our government, especially our federal government.
Yeah, you're making a good point. I mean, it's an issue like many issues with a lot of room for nuanced discussion and very personal decision making. And so, yeah, I think that's just like many issues that we've been discussing on the cultural level recently that are framed as black and white issues with two opposing sides, and that's really not the case. So, and I agree with you also about the need to have these broader discussions openly, and I'm really grateful that you've been willing to share so much of your own story and your own process as you've come to be where you are right now.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I really value this opportunity and really appreciate the work that you're doing to have these discussions. You've really created a wonderful platform for people to have these difficult discussions and to share and to create more dialogue. And we really need more dialogue. I think, because of cancel culture, we've shut down dialogue. We've shut down dissenting opinions. We've forced people into these, two camps. You're, either on the right side or you're on the wrong side. And to sit back and say, wait, let's step back from this. Let's take a look. Let's actually break this down. Let's get into a place that's uncomfortable, right? I think, as you mentioned, this coddling of society, this coddling behavior that we've developed, we're so afraid as a society of being uncomfortable. We need to be in a safe space. And I think it is so important for our social and intellectual development that we push boundaries. I mean, education, liberal education, which is what our education system was founded on questioning and being in these uncomfortable situations. And instead, today we've replaced that with political correctness and anti-bias training, and cancel culture and trigger to say, oh no, this is too much for you to talk about or think about. This could hurt you. And also, I think, you know, one huge problem there has been conflating emotional harm with physical harm as well. That you're, you know, you're hurting me,
Absolutely.
you're attacking me, and that we've become such a society that supports weakness, weak individuals, instead of really supporting individuals to fight adversity, to push through, to make difficult decisions, to counter difficult situations, and to really see the reward and success that comes from true achievement, from true hard work.
Absolutely. And I agree with you. I think that these conversations are so valuable. And thank you so much for sharing your perspective with me today. And yes, if you have any links that you'd like to share with people, please feel free to send those to me. I'll put them in the notes underneath of this episode on the video channel. Thank you again, Jared.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Leslie. Really appreciate it. And thank you again for having me.